Hi, I'm Dr. Patrick Foy. I'm an MD or medical doctor, and I'm the director of the Coccyx Pain Center or Tailbone Pain Center here in the United States, online at tailbonedoctor.com. And this is the next in the series of videos going chapter by chapter through my book, Tailbone Pain Relief Now. And in this chapter, we're up to chapter number 7, which is Tailbone Fractures, the Broken Coccyx. And this is a really important chapter because fractures of the tailbone, number one, they can be very painful and they can take a very long time to heal. But number two is that it's probably the most overdiagnosed and misdiagnosed condition at the tailbone. It is very, very common that people will have some trauma, they slip and fall, they land on their buttocks, they land on their coccyx or tailbone, and then they have some pain, and maybe they go to see their primary care doctor or a musculoskeletal specialist, or even they go to the emergency room, and the doctor will say, oh, well, you know what, you fractured your tailbone. Sometimes without even getting an x-ray. Or they'll get the wrong x-ray, it'll be of the lumbar spine, or they won't do the proper imaging to properly show the tailbone, but they'll be told, you know what, you probably fractured your tailbone. And it's important because you really want to have an accurate diagnosis so that you can develop a treatment plan based on an accurate diagnosis rather than just somebody saying off the top of their head, maybe it's fractured. The way I would think about this and the way I describe it to patients is as follows. If you think about the bones of the coccyx, really they are, this is the sacrum up here, and then the coccyx or tailbone is shown right down here. And from the side view, it looks, sort of like that. So the coccyx is really a series of bones. You can see that there's a number of bony segments, here, and sometimes parts of them are fused together and sometimes not. And the reason that's important in this chapter and this discussion about fractures is that sometimes a emergency room physician or someone, maybe even a radiologist, will look and see that there's discrete individual segments at the tailbone, as shown here. And they'll think, oh, well, you know what? Maybe there's that section down at the bottom is fractured off. I see a space, I see a lucency, a clear area where there's no bone there. And the reason why that can be misleading is because there's supposed to be a clear space between the bones if the bones are not fused together. Just like if you took an X-ray of my fingers, you would have, a bone here. And then you would have a clear space where the joint is, and then you would have the next bone and a space, and then the next bone and a space. So where the knuckles are, there would be a joint space in those areas. And the same is true at the tailbone. But unfortunately, many, many times, the emergency room doctor or the radiologist will somehow forget the basics that they know anywhere else in the body, and when it comes to the tailbone, they'll see that lucency and they'll call it as a fracture. They'll see that lucency and they'll say, yes, there's a chip of the bone that came off, when really it's just the normal joint space that we expect to be there in most of us, in all of us that do not have a fused coccyx. So what is a fracture then? Well, a fracture is when you actually have broken the bone. And the easiest way to think about this is I describe it as if you think about a stack of bricks. If you were stacking bricks one on top of the other, the tall way, that would be a little bit similar to the bones in the coccyx, stacked one on top of the other here. And you would expect there to be a joint space, a little bit of space in between those bricks, a little sliver of air in between brick number 1 and brick number 2 and brick number 3, etc. And when you see that little bit of joint space, that's not a fracture. The brick, each individual brick, if it's still intact, then there's no fracture. So similarly for the coccyx, if each individual bone of the coccyx is intact, there's no fracture. Now what people may have is they may have a dislocation. They may have where one bone has moved away from the other, but that's not a fracture. Back to our brick example, that would be two bricks that are moved apart. but they're still intact. Each individual brick is not chipped or broken. So that's the real distinguishing factor between a dislocation and a fracture. And there's another chapter where we'll talk more about dislocations. So then what is a fracture? Again, a fracture is when a piece of the bone is actually broken. So as shown here, that can happen in a number of different ways. In this top bone here, we have basically what's called a hairline fracture, which is you can see the fracture line sort of going through the going through the bone here, but the pieces of the bone are still essentially together. So that's a hairline fracture. And what's more severe is what's called a displaced fracture, which is here where a piece of the bone has actually separated from the rest of the bone. So the difference between a hairline fracture, also called a non-displaced fracture, and a displaced fracture is whether one piece of a given bone has actually separated from the other piece that it was, of that same bone that it was normally attached to. So that's a non-displaced fracture versus a displaced fracture. Another term you'll sometimes hear is a comminuted fracture, which just basically means that unfortunately the bone is shattered. So it's broken up into many, many pieces. So think about dropping a teacup and it shatters into many pieces. That would be equivalent to a comminuted fracture. There are, again, different types of fractures. And in the chapter we go into the fact that to make a diagnosis of a fracture, you really need imaging studies. So just knowing that somebody is tender there, or that they have some bruising, or that they had some trauma, that alone is not enough to officially make a diagnosis of a fracture. You really need to have the imaging studies to see what's going on with the bones and are the individual bones intact or not. So to do that, you have to have the proper imaging studies done, and unfortunately it's very, very common that the proper imaging studies either are, no imaging are done at all, or the proper imaging studies are not performed. So the ordering physician and the radiology technician and the radiologist need to have some insight or experience in evaluating tailbone pain and tailbone problems and tailbone injuries in order to do the appropriate proper tests. The treatment for a fracture really depends on how severe the pain is, and there are medications, and the book goes into more of the details, but there are medications that can be used to help to relieve the pain. But a couple of things that I'll point out is that treating a fracture at the tailbone is very different than treating a fracture in most other parts of the body. Because if I had a fracture in my arm, what we could do is we could put my arm in a cast, but you can't put your tailbone in a cast. We could put, for my arm, we could put rods and screws in place to hold the fracture stable. But really that's not so easy at the tailbone. The tailbone are these little tiny bony segments, and putting rods and screws through them, often the tailbone bones themselves would probably crumble to some extent. So it's really challenging. Also, you don't want to just fuse it with rods and screws, because then you'd be sitting on rods and screws, which would be painful. And also, there's supposed to be some mobility or movement at the tailbone. So if you were to fuse it with orthopedic hardware, you would lose the normal mobility that you need, and then the tailbone would be in the way. Every time that you go to sit down, it would fail to move out of the way. It would fail to move as normal. So also you can do non-weight bearing in other parts of the body. Like if I had a fracture in my leg, we could use crutches, so I don't put any weight on that leg. But at the tailbone, that's not so easy. And at the tailbone, you'd be basically saying, well, do not sit, because that's the weight-bearing position. But it's very, very difficult in modern society to go through the day without sitting. You need to sit to drive in your car, or to commute, or while you're on your computer workstation to some extent. And some of that we can work around, but still, we can stand more, but it's very, very difficult to stand through the entire day. So very, very challenging with, in some ways, in terms of treating fractures at the coccyx. There certainly are treatments that can be done. Later in the book, we'll get into the chapters about treatment, but there are medications, there are injections, there are other things that are available that do provide relief for the majority of patients. There's more information in the book. If you're interested in getting a copy of the book, the easiest way to do that is to go to www.tailbonebook.com, and from there I'll have the links to specifically to the direct Amazon pages for your specific country, whether you're in the United States or Canada or Europe, UK, etc. I have those listed on there. So that's the easiest way to go to get the book. The book is available both as a paperback copy and also as an ebook, so you can get the ebook copy, which you can basically download and read that any place in the world where you have internet access. You can get that book that way. If you're looking to find me online, the best way to find me is to just go to my website, which is www.tailbonedoctor.com, and you can find me there. Post your comments down below if you have questions about fractures at the tailbone, if you've been told you had a fracture but they never did an x-ray or imaging study to actually confirm it, or you had a fracture but you found out later it was never fractured in the first place, or you were told that it wasn't fractured and finally they got the imaging and found out that it was. Post your comments and thoughts and questions down below, and we'll be on the lookout to respond to those. Hope this video is helpful, and all the best. Bye-bye.